The year was 1623, and the air in Oxford was thick with tension. Daniel Featley, a fiery Protestant preacher, stood in the grand hall of the university ready to face his opponent, John Fisher, a Jesuit priest. The stakes were high. This wasn't just a debate. It was a battle for the soul of England. The room was packed with scholars, clergy, and curious onlookers. Some were there to support Featley, the champion of the Protestant faith. Others came to see Fisher, the eloquent defender of the Catholic Church. But everyone knew that this debate could change the course of religious history. As Featley and Fisher faced each other, the silence was almost deafening. Fisher, with his calm and confident demeanor, began by demanding that Featley produce a catalogue of names, proof that the Protestant faith had existed in all ages from the early church to the present day. Fisher argued that if the Protestant faith was truly the true church, it should have a continuous lineage of believers throughout history. Featley, however, was not one to back down easily. He denied that he was obligated to produce such a catalogue. "Why should I seek the golden purity of faith amidst the dung and dross of Romish superstitions?" he retorted. Featley believed that the true church was not defined by a list of names, but by its adherence to Scripture. He argued that the Protestant faith had always been present, even if it wasn't always visible. But Fisher was persistent. He pointed out that many of Featley's fellow Protestants had already tried to compile such a list, focusing on figures like the schoolmen, abbots, and even popes who held proto-Protestant views. These figures, Fisher argued, were the most vehement opponents of the Hussites, Waldensians, and Lollards, groups that had championed the proto-Protestant cause. Featley, however, had a different approach. He believed in an invisible elite within the Roman Church, people who, throughout the centuries, held proto-Protestant beliefs. He argued that these individuals were the true guardians of the faith, even if they remained within the corrupt structures of the Catholic Church. As the debate raged on, Featley found himself in a difficult position. He knew that the lack of explicit Protestant history before Martin Luther was a serious point of theological vulnerability. When he finally conceded to producing a list of names, he did so in a way that would minimize his own position's weaknesses. He insisted that the list should start with the early church, where the Protestant faith was more clearly visible, rather than in the Dark Ages, immediately before the Reformation. To complicate matters, Featley's list was not his own. He claimed that a friend, possibly Thomas James, the librarian of the Bodleian Library, had given him a catalogue of names. Featley presented this list to Fisher, but he was quick to add that he had not had the time to examine it thoroughly. This move allowed him to meet Fisher's demand while avoiding direct responsibility for the list's contents. The debate continued, with Featley and Fisher trading sharp arguments and counter-arguments. Featley demanded that the Catholic Church produce its own list of names, showing that it had been visible in all ages, especially in the first 600 years. He argued that Fisher could never produce a list of visible assembly of Christians who held to the beliefs of the Council of Trent. As the debate drew to a close, Featley's tactics became clear. He had used Fisher's own demands against him, showing that the Protestant faith could triumph, even when judged by its opponent's standards. But the real battle is just beginning. The publication of the debate's proceedings would soon bring the conflict to a wider audience, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Outside the hall, the political winds were shifting. King James I, who had initially been displeased with the debate, changed his stance as the Spanish match negotiations collapsed. The king, now more favorable to the Protestants, endorsed the publication of the debate, turning it into a powerful tool in the ongoing struggle against Catholicism. But Featley's victory was not without its costs. His relationship with the authorities, particularly Richard Neile, a key opponent of the Calvinists, became strained. Featley's harsh words about those who had tried to end the debate prematurely did not go unnoticed. The battle for the soul of England was far from over, and Featley knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. As the crowd dispersed, Featley left the hall with a sense of both triumph and trepidation. The debate had been a significant moment, but the real test of his faith and his arguments was only just beginning. The early 1620s were a tense time for Protestants in England. The idea of a marriage between the Protestant King James I's daughter and a Catholic prince from Spain known as the Spanish Match was causing a lot of fear. Many Protestants worried that this marriage would lead to more tolerance for Catholics and the spread of Catholic beliefs in England. Protestant ministers were especially anxious, as they feared losing their influence and the souls of their followers to Catholicism. In 1624, the House of Commons was concerned about the increasing number of Catholic books being printed and distributed. They feared that these books would further spread Catholic ideas and weaken the Protestant faith. One of the key figures in this struggle was Daniel Featley, a prominent Protestant minister. Featley was known for his strong anti-Catholic stance and his efforts to keep the Protestant faith strong. Featley was particularly worried about the Countess of Buckingham, who was having doubts about her faith. He had started writing a treatise and a letter to help her, but he was not chosen to speak with her. Instead, the more moderate ministers, White and Laud, were selected. This choice was not an accident. White and Laud had less rigid views, which made them better suited to negotiate with Catholics without causing too much conflict. They were rewarded for their efforts, and their success indicated a shift in power away from Featley and other strict Protestant ministers. The fear of a Catholic queen and a potential Catholic conspiracy to overthrow the monarchy was widespread. Featley saw this as a threat and worked hard to combat what he saw as a false faith. He used anti-Catholic publications and debates to reassure Protestants and prevent them from converting to Catholicism. As Peter Lake noted, anti-Catholic rhetoric could be very effective during times of fear and uncertainty because it tapped into deeply held beliefs and values. One of Featley's notable debates was with a man named Buggs, who had a son who had converted to Catholicism. After the debate, Featley claimed that Buggs was so convinced of his Protestant faith that he would even disown his son if he didn't leave the Catholic Church. While this might have been a bit of propaganda, it was meant to show that Featley's arguments were strong enough to overcome even the strongest family ties. In the 1630s, Featley published accounts of his earlier debates in Paris. These debates had taken place in the early 1610s, when he was a chaplain to Thomas Edmonds. The publications were aimed at several goals. First, Featley wanted to undermine the Catholic Richard Smith, who was under pressure from the king and Parliament. Second, he hoped to stop the spread of Catholicism at court, which had increased due to the French match. Third, he wanted to boost his own reputation and revitalize the anti-Catholic efforts that had been silenced by the more moderate policies of the Laudian regime. One of Featley's most famous debates in Paris was with Richard Smith, a Catholic leader. The debate took place at the home of an English gentleman, M. Nevitt, and was attended by notable figures like the playwright Ben Jonson. Featley's main issues were with the Catholic doctrines of transubstantiation and the practice of giving only the bread, not the wine, to the laity during communion. He argued that while Christ is present in the bread, the idea that Christ's body is physically present in the bread and wine was a form of cannibalism, which he found deeply troubling. Smith was a significant figure in the Catholic community and had been involved in the negotiations for the French match. He was optimistic about the possibility of Catholic toleration in England, but his position became precarious in the late 1620s. The Protestant Parliament was suspicious of Charles I's sympathy toward Catholics and the influence of his Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria. Featley's publication of the Paris Debates was part of a broader effort to portray Smith as a threat to the English state and to show that he had a history of hostility toward the Protestant Church. Featley's publication was also a personal move to enhance his reputation and secure his position. He was appointed as the provost of Chelsea College, a center for anti-Catholic training, and he wanted to ensure that the college remained strong. Despite the challenges, Featley continued to be a leading figure in the fight against Catholicism, even as the political landscape shifted around him. Chelsea College, founded in 1610, was a key institution for training anti-Catholic polemicists. Featley's predecessor, Matthew Sutcliffe, had been concerned about the rise of anti-Calvinism and the potential decline of the college. Sutcliffe appointed Featley as his successor, hoping that he would continue the college's mission. Featley worked hard to maintain the college's focus on combating Catholicism, but he faced challenges, including the mismanagement of funds. Despite these difficulties, Featley's efforts to publish his debates and strengthen Chelsea College were part of a broader struggle to protect the Protestant faith in a time of great uncertainty and fear. His work reflected the deep tensions and anxieties of the era, as Protestants and Catholics vied for influence and the future of England's religious landscape hung in the balance. Daniel Featley faced a lot of opposition during his time as provost of Chelsea College. The Laudians, who were supporters of William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, believed that Chelsea College was a symbol of anti-Catholicism, which went against the views of the Caroline regime. They thought the money set aside for the college should be used to beautify churches instead. For example, in 1636, George Coddington, a Laudian minister, wrote to William Laud asking if they could use the funds to repair St. Paul's Church instead. King Charles I also didn't care much for Chelsea College and even suggested it should be turned into a pest house, a place for people with the plague. When Sir Francis Kynaston, the regent of the Museum Minervae, asked the king for permission to move his academy to Chelsea College during the plague, Featley refused to let them in. This led Kynaston to petition William Laud, who was Charles's advisor. Featley responded by saying he had good reasons to deny Kynaston entry because one of the people in Kynaston's group had brought the plague to a nearby house, and one of the professors at the new academy was a Catholic who had left the Church of England. For Featley, the main issue was allowing Catholics into an anti-Catholic institution. He feared that letting them in would not only expose the college to the physical dangers of the plague, but also to the spiritual dangers of Catholicism. Many English Reformed ministers were worried that Catholicism was influencing the monarchy and the Church, just as the plague was affecting the people. Featley's defense of Chelsea College was part of his broader goal, to fight against the Laudian and Caroline regime's efforts to downplay anti-Catholic views. In the late 1630s, Featley continued his anti-Catholic activities, but in a more indirect way. In 1638, he helped publish a final reply by Humphrey Lind, who had written two famous anti-Catholic books, Via Tuta and Via Devia. These books criticized the Roman Church and defended the Protestant faith. Featley published Lind's last work, A Case for the Spectacles, along with his own sermon at Lind's funeral, and another work called Stricturi in Lindomastigam. Featley claimed that the latter was not his own but Lind's, though it was likely his own. Lind was a close friend of Featley's and had been involved in debates with Catholic authors. He had also hosted a debate between Featley and the Catholic John Fisher. Featley said he edited Lind's work out of respect and because his friends asked him to. He claimed he didn't add anything new to the argument and didn't intend to create a new weapon against Catholicism, but rather to continue the work Lind had started. However, given the similarity to Featley's own anti-Catholic writings, publishing this work was a way for Featley to combat Catholicism without putting his name directly on it. Featley's actions were driven by his strong anti-Catholic beliefs and his concern for the spiritual well-being of his fellow Protestants. He saw the Laudian and Caroline regime as being too sympathetic to Catholicism and felt that militant anti-Catholic polemic was being suppressed. By publishing Lynn's work, Featley was trying to revive the kind of anti-Catholic writing that was being pushed out by the regime. Throughout the 1630s, Featley was cautious about engaging in public anti-Catholic debates. He had only one significant debate with a Catholic, the Jesuit Thomas Everard, in 1626. By publishing Lynn's work, Featley could continue his anti-Catholic efforts without risking punishment. This strategy was similar to his earlier actions, where he published the works of others to spread his ideas. In the end, Featley's actions show how deeply he cared about protecting the Protestant faith. His polemical writings and his defense of Chelsea College were not just about arguing against Catholicism. They were about safeguarding the spiritual health of his community. Featley's efforts to combat Catholicism were driven by his strong pastoral concerns, showing that a caring pastor could also be a fierce polemicist when he believed the stakes were high. In 1626, Daniel Featley, a prominent English theologian, took to the printing press to challenge the growing influence of Richard Montague, who was promoting ideas that Featley saw as dangerous to the Church of England. Featley wrote two books, A Parallel, of New Old Pelagian Error, and a second parallel together with a writ of error, sued against the Appealer. These books were aimed at countering what Featley believed were the heretical teachings of Montague. Montague had previously responded to a book called The Gag of the Reformed Gospel, written by John Higham. In this book, Higham listed 47 points that he believed represented the teachings of the Church of England. Montague, however, disagreed with many of these points. He wrote two responses, A Gag for the New Gospel in 1624 and Appellocerum in 1625. In these responses, Montague argued that only some of Higham's points were true doctrines of the English Church. He claimed that many of the other points were actually ideas from extreme Puritanism, which he did not support. Montague also expressed views that were controversial at the time. He did not believe that the Pope was the Antichrist, a common belief among many Protestants. Instead, he argued that the Roman Catholic Church was still a true church, even though it had some practices that he disagreed with. This was a significant departure from the mainstream Protestant view, which often saw the Roman Catholic Church as corrupt and false. Featley's attack on Montague was part of a larger debate about the nature of salvation and the authority of the Church. Featley and other Reformed theologians believed in the doctrine of predestination, which holds that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will not. They also believed that human beings are incapable of saving themselves and that salvation comes solely through God's grace. Montague, on the other hand, leaned towards Arminianism, which emphasizes human free will and the possibility of salvation through faith and good works. The debate between Featley and Montague was not just a theological disagreement, it had political implications as well. The Church of England was trying to maintain a middle ground between Puritanism and Roman Catholicism, and Montague's views threatened to upset this delicate balance. Featley saw Montague's ideas as a slippery slope that could lead to a return to Catholicism, which was a major concern for many Protestants at the time. The controversy between Featley and Montague reflected broader tensions in English society. The Church of England was still relatively new, and its identity was still being shaped. The debate over soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, was a key part of this process. Featley's efforts to defend the Reformed position were part of a larger struggle to define what it meant to be a true Christian in the Church of England. Despite the heated nature of the debate, both Featley and Montague were respected figures in their own right. Featley was known for his sharp wit and his ability to argue effectively, while Montague was respected for his learning and his moderate approach. Their disagreement, however, highlighted the deep divisions within the Church of England and the ongoing struggle to reconcile different theological perspectives. The debate between Featley and Montague continued to influence religious and political discussions in England for years to come. It was a pivotal moment in the history of the Church of England, shaping the way people thought about salvation, the nature of the Church, and the role of individual faith. Daniel Featley, a prominent English minister, saw Richard Montague's ideas as a major threat to the established Church. Featley believed that Montague's views were not just new, but were actually old heresies in disguise. Specifically, he thought Montague's ideas were a mix of Pelagianism, Arminianism, and Catholicism. Let's dive into how Featley saw these connections and what he did about it. Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism were ancient beliefs that Featley thought Montague was reviving. Pelagianism, named after the theologian Pelagius, taught that humans could achieve salvation through their own efforts, without needing divine grace. This idea was strongly opposed by St. Augustine, and was declared a heresy in 418. Semi-Pelagianism, which came a bit later, tried to find a middle ground between Pelagius and Augustine. It suggested that, while humans need divine grace, they can also initiate their salvation through their own will. Both of these ideas were condemned by the early Church. Featley argued that Montague's teachings were a new version of these old heresies. He used writings from early Church Fathers, especially Augustine, to show that Montague's ideas were similar to those of Pelagius and semi-Pelagians. For example, Featley pointed out that both Pelagians and Arminians, followers of Jacobus Arminius, denied the idea of original sin, which is the belief that all humans are born with the sin of Adam. He cited Augustine to show that Pelagians believed there was no original sin, and that people were not born with a sin that would condemn them. Featley then compared these ideas to what Arminians and Montague said, showing that they also denied original sin. Another key point Featley made was that both Pelagians and Arminians believed that free will played a crucial role in salvation. They thought that people could choose to be saved, and that God's grace was only a helper, not the primary force. Featley used Augustine and other early church writings to show that Pelagians believed humans could earn grace through their own efforts. He then linked this to what Arminians and Montague said, showing that they also believed free will was the main factor in salvation. Featley also argued that both Pelagians and Arminians believed that God's election, choosing who would be saved, was based on foreseen faith or good works. This meant that God chose people for salvation because he saw they would believe or do good things. Featley used this to show that Montague's ideas were similar to these ancient heresies. In addition to these theological points, Featley was concerned about the influence of Dutch Arminianism on Montague. Arminianism was a movement that started in the Netherlands and spread to England. Featley believed that Montague was influenced by Arminian writings and was spreading these ideas in the English Church. He pointed out that Montague used the same arguments and even the same words as Arminian writers like Jacobus Arminius and Peter Bertius. This made Featley even more convinced that Montague's ideas were dangerous. Featley's goal was not just to win a theological debate, but to protect the Church from what he saw as heretical ideas. He used historical and patristic sources to show that Montague's views were not new, but were a revival of old heresies. By doing this, Featley hoped to convince people that Montague's ideas were not just different, but were actually harmful to the Church. Throughout his writings, Featley also emphasized the importance of Augustine's teachings. He and other Reformed ministers often called their views Augustinian to show that they were in line with the early Church. However, Featley sometimes ignored the differences between Augustine's theology and their own to strengthen their claim to being truly Augustinian. This was a common strategy among Reformed divines to show that their beliefs were the true and ancient faith. In his efforts to combat Montague's ideas, Featley also had pastoral concerns. He wanted to ensure that the Church remained true to its Reformed roots, and that people were not led astray by what he saw as dangerous and heretical teachings. By linking Montague's views to ancient heresies and Dutch Arminianism, Featley hoped to rally support from other Reformed ministers and the broader Church community. Overall, Featley's approach was to use history and theology to show that Montague's ideas were not just different, but were a revival of ancient heresies. He believed that by doing this, he could protect the Church and maintain its Reformed identity. Montague, a prominent figure in the Church of England during the early 17th century, was often accused of being an Arminian, a follower of the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius. Arminius and his followers, known as Arminians, had different views on salvation and predestination compared to the Calvinists, who dominated the Reformed churches. Montague's interest in Arminian ideas was evident in his writings, but the timing of his exposure to these ideas is a bit unclear. In a letter to John Coulson in June 1625, Montague asked for a copy of Arminius's writings. He received the copy by May 1626 and was so impressed that he wrote, "Arminius had more in him than all the Netherlands." However, it's more likely that Montague was influenced by another Dutch theologian, Peter Bertius. William Prynne, one of Montague's critics, claimed that Montague plagiarized Bertius's work, De Apostasia Sanctorum, saying that Montague's quotations were recorded verbatim from Bertius's book. Another critic, Daniel Featley, also noticed similarities between Montague's and Bertius's work, describing Montague as an echo of Arminius or Bertius. Montague had connections with Dutch Arminians. During his time at King's College, Cambridge, he thanked Richard Dutch Thompson for his scholarly help. Thompson, along with Hugo Grotius and Peter Bertius, had strong ties to anti-Calvinist divines in England, such as Lancelot Andrewes, William Barlow, and John Overofter. These links became even more significant as the Synod of Dort approached in 1618. The Synod was a major gathering of Reformed leaders to address Arminianism, and there were discussions about who would represent England. Montague and his allies were not chosen, but this didn't stop them from being seen as sympathetic to Arminian ideas. Montague's most important association was with the Durham House group, named after Richard Niles' palace in the Strand. This group, which included Montague, John Cozen, and William Laud, among others, was a hub for anti-Calvinist thought. They supported each other's publications and worked to promote their views within the Church of England. However, they were cautious about being too closely linked with Dutch Arminians, as this could have been seen as heretical by the Reformed majority. The debates between Reformed and anti-Calvinist factions were not just about abstract theological concepts. They were also about how these ideas affected people's spiritual lives. Featley, a leading Reformed divine, argued that predestination was a comforting doctrine, providing unspeakable comfort to godly persons. He saw Arminianism as dangerous because it made God's election depend on human will, which he believed eroded the solid and firm ground of comfort. Other Reformed divines like Prynne and Burton echoed these concerns, emphasizing that only through Reformed doctrine could one have certainty of salvation. Reformed divines were worried that anti-Calvinist ideas could lead people away from the true faith. Featley believed that Montague's theological positions were a threat to the Church of England. He saw Montague as part of a larger Arminian movement that was trying to infiltrate the established church. Featley's concern was not just academic. He believed that these ideas could harm the spiritual well-being of the laity. Featley also accused Montague of having sympathies with Roman Catholicism. Montague had suggested that the differences between the Church of England and Rome were not significant, and that the Pope was not the Antichrist. Featley found these views alarming and used the same apocalyptic language he used against Catholics to describe Montague. He even went so far as to call Montague the beast from the Book of Revelation, suggesting that Montague was acting against the true church. Despite these accusations, Montague's approach was actually motivated by a desire to bring Catholics back to the Protestant faith. He believed that a more gentle and courteous approach would be more effective than the harsh anti-Catholic rhetoric that was common at the time. Montague tried to minimize the differences between Protestant and Catholic beliefs to make it easier for Catholics to attend Protestant services. This strategy was part of a broader effort by the Laudian regime to promote religious harmony, even if it meant being accused of having crypto-Catholic sympathies. In his own way, Featley also showed a more conciliatory attitude toward Catholicism. He acknowledged that Catholicism shared many fundamental doctrines with Protestantism, and that salvation was possible within the Church of Rome. However, he was still critical of Montague's views, seeing them as a dangerous deviation from the established Reformed doctrine. The debates between Featley and Montague highlight the complex and often personal nature of theological disputes in the 17th century. Both men were driven by a desire to guide people toward what they believed was the true faith, but their methods and conclusions were vastly different. These differences reveal the deep divisions within the Church of England and the broader Reformed world as they grappled with the challenges of doctrine, pastoral care, and the threat of heresy. Daniel Featley, a devout Reformed minister, saw Richard Montague's efforts to build bridges with Catholics as a direct threat to his own mission. Over the years, Featley had engaged in numerous debates with prominent Catholics, discussing issues like transubstantiation, the marks of a true church, and whether the Pope was the Antichrist. These were the very same issues that Montague considered insignificant. Featley believed that these debates were crucial for protecting the established church and ensuring people's salvation. To Featley, Montague's attempts to find common ground with Catholics were not just misguided, but dangerous, as they could lead people away from what Featley saw as true Christianity. During the 1620s, Featley and other Reformed ministers saw Montague's theological views as not only doctrinally threatening, but also politically dangerous. They feared that Montague's ideas could undermine both the church and the state. For example, Anthony Wotton wrote about the dangers of Montague's theology, arguing that it could lead to the ruin of both institutions. Henry Burton also warned that Montague's views could cause the church and state to die together because they were so intertwined. In 1624, Featley and a group of other Reformed ministers, including Thomas Goad, Joseph Hall, Nathaniel Ward, and John Prideaux, drafted a petition against Montague. This petition, passed on to the House of Commons by John Pym, detailed Montague's heretical views in 21 articles. Although the original articles are lost, we can reconstruct their contents from Montague's responses and his correspondence with John Cosson. Featley was particularly pleased with the support of John Pym, whom he saw as a pillar of religion in Parliament. The House of Commons eventually passed the matter to Archbishop Abbott, hoping he would take action against Montague. However, despite their efforts, Abbott made little progress. Montague published his response, Appello Serum, with what some believed was King James' support. Abbott managed to get Montague to promise a revised edition of his book, but it was never published. The Reformed ministers, including Thomas Morton and John Preston, were unable to secure an official censure of Montague's views. Montague was well aware of the Reformed divine's plans. He received a copy of the articles from a friend at Lambeth House and believed that Featley and John Prideaux were the main organizers. Montague shared these articles with John Cosin, and in a letter he mentioned that Featley had tried to draw Francis White into their plot. Montague also noted that Featley later denied collecting the objections which Montague saw as a lie. In a later conversation, Featley tried to distance himself from his earlier opposition, but Montague was not convinced. In response to the Reformed attacks, Montague considered naming Featley and Prideaux in his Appello Caesarim. He even thought about adding a postscript to lash out at his opponents, but eventually decided to name them only as Yates and his fellow informers. Montague added more content to his work, including references to William Perkins, a respected Reformed theologian, to challenge Featley's views. He also added a distinctly anti-Calvinist perspective on justification which he believed Featley would have to address. Both Featley and Montague believed their opponents were part of a conspiracy to undermine them. Featley saw the anti-Calvinists as a threat to the Reformed cause, while Montague saw the Reformed divines as a threat to the new anti-Calvinist faction at court. This mutual distrust created a tense atmosphere in which both sides sought to protect their positions. The debate over who had the authority to decide matters of doctrine added to the tension. Reformed divines like William Prynne and Anthony Wotton argued that Parliament should handle religious heterodoxy, while bishops believed that such decisions were outside Parliament's jurisdiction. King Charles I initially supported the Reformed divines, but by 1626 he issued a proclamation prohibiting new religious ideas that deviated from the established church's teachings. To counter the growing influence of anti-Calvinists, Featley and other Reformed divines claimed that King James had always supported the Reformed cause. Featley told stories of James's strong opposition to Arminianism, even in the months before his death. He recounted how James branded Arminius's work as heretical, and how he influenced Featley to coin the term Pelagiarminianism. Other Reformed divines, like Francis Roos and John Yates, also defended James's Reformed credentials, citing his actions against Arminian theologians. However, it is important to note that James's views may have become more moderate toward the end of his life. Peter Heylin suggested that James began to see Arminianism in a more favorable light, and Montague and his allies argued that they were simply separating private opinions from the Church's doctrine. The battle over James's legacy continued, with both sides using his actions and words to support their own causes. Featley's responses to Montague, a parallel and a second parallel, were published anonymously. In the prefaces, the author claimed to have found the original works and translated them to shed light on the Arminian controversy. This anonymity added to the mystery and tension surrounding the debate, as readers were left to wonder about the true identity of the author. Daniel Featley was a man of strong beliefs and a fierce defender of the Reformed faith. In the early 1620s, he found himself in a challenging situation. The political and religious landscape of England was shifting, and Featley's position was becoming increasingly precarious. He had hoped to rise in the church through his connections with the Duke and Duchess of Buckingham, but when he realized they supported the Arminian faction, he decided to stand against them. This decision cost him his chances for advancement at court. In 1626, Featley published two works, A Parallel and The Second Parallel, both aimed at refuting the ideas of Richard Montague, who was seen as a supporter of Arminianism, a theological movement that Featley believed was a dangerous deviation from true Reformed doctrine. Featley's strategy was to link Arminianism with the ancient heresy of Pelagianism, suggesting that both denied the essential role of divine grace in salvation. By doing this, Featley hoped to show that Arminianism was not only wrong, but also a threat to the established church. Despite his efforts, Featley's works did not receive the support he had hoped for. King James I, who had previously shown favor to Reformed divines, seemed to be giving more attention to anti-Calvinists. This shift in the king's preferences was evident when James instructed Francis White, rather than Featley, to review Montague's Apellocerum. Featley was further moralized when he was scolded for licensing works by Elton and Crompton, which were seen as supportive of Reformed views. The political and religious changes of the 1620s were significant. Historians have debated whether anti-Calvinists had already gained power before Charles I's reign. Some argue that Calvinism remained the dominant theology during James's reign, while others believe that the tide had turned in favor of Arminianism by 1618. Featley and other Reformed divines tried to cope with these changes by presenting a vision of the past where the Reformed faith was still strong and supported by the king. In 1644, Featley wrote Sacra Nemesis, a work in which he defended his actions and reputation. He argued that his opposition to Arminianism was motivated by a deep commitment to the Reformed Church, even if it meant losing his position. Featley's efforts to protect the Church from what he saw as dangerous influences reveal the complex and often contentious nature of religious debates in early Stuart England. Featley's polemical tactics, such as linking Arminianism with Pelagianism, were not unique. Other Reformed ministers used similar strategies to defend their beliefs. However, Featley's approach also shows how Reformed ministers adapted their arguments to the changing political environment. By the mid-1620s, Reformed divines were increasingly marginalized, and they had to find ways to maintain their influence and protect their beliefs. In the end, Featley's life and work reflect the broader struggles of the Reformed Church in early Stuart England. His efforts to defend the Reformed faith, even at great personal cost, highlight the importance of theological debates in shaping the religious landscape of the time. Despite the challenges he faced, Featley remained a dedicated and influential figure in the Reformed tradition, leaving a lasting impact on the Church and the theological debates of his era.